Ladies and gentlemen, or indeed good day, wherever you are in the world. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. My name is Sue Black, and I'm honoured to be the president of the Royal Anthropological Institute. Tonight, we're here to hear the Henry Myers Lecture of the Royal Anthropological Institute, which is devoted to anthropology and its relationship with religion or spirituality. It's been delivered by some of the most distinguished practitioners over the last century, including Mary Douglas, Edmund Leach, Louis Dumont, Ernest Gellner, and Bruno Latour will be delivering a plenary address to us tomorrow as part of our conference. We are so delighted to welcome David Gellner here today. Professor Gellner began his career at Brunel University, where he taught for 8 years before moving to Oxford University, where he holds the chair of social anthropology and is a fellow of All Souls College. Amongst his many projects, he has held a Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship to work on Nepal and has been visiting professor in Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. He's twice been head of the School of Anthropology, the Museum of Ethnography at Oxford, and on each occasion with conspicuous success. A specialist on Nepal, he has written extensively on ethnicity, caste, and inequality, as well as healers, mediums, and popular approaches to misfortune, borderlands, and cultural and religious change. Amongst his varied works are the theoretical exploration of applications of Weberian thought to Buddhism and Hinduism, the detailed ethnographic presentation of the Nuers of the Kathmandu Valley, and outstanding analysis of the state and resistance in Nepal. Amongst his recent projects are studies of the Nepalese diaspora and democratization in South Asia. Tonight, he will be sharing with us his latest research on the spaces of religion, a view from South Asia. And as the talk progresses, please feel free to place questions online, and he's very, very kindly agreed to answer some of those questions. And so the more you put up, the greater the variety of discussion we can have this evening. So ladies and gentlemen, it is a true pleasure for me and for the Royal Anthropological Institute to welcome David to present the lecture this evening. David, it's over to you.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Sue, for that really very kind introduction. You left out one. My first teaching job was actually at Oxford Brookes for 2 years. I was there for 2 years before I was at Brunel. Well, let me start by thanking the RAI for doing me this honor. Sue has mentioned some of the very distinguished names who've given it before. I personally attended the recent Myers lectures given by Bruno Latour and Simon Coleman, so it's a great pleasure to follow in their footsteps. I'm sorry only that I'm not able to give my lecture as they did in the British Museum. But anyway, I suppose this format has some advantages, and thank you everybody for being here. I see from the chat that we even have somebody from Bhutan, so maybe even further afield as well. So thank you all very much. As you can see, I put on one of my Nepalese hand-woven ties for the occasion. And thank you also to all those friends who've given me advice and support, and as always, to my wife, DP Martinez. Now, Henry Myers wanted a forum for the discussion of man's spiritual evolution. Remember, this was the 1940s, and the lecture is entitled The Henry Myers Lecture on the Place of Religious Belief in Human Development. So if I may be allowed to replace belief with practice and development with history, perhaps I can say something that falls within the remit of the founder's intentions. In social anthropology, as in many other disciplines, we face increasing calls from our students to decolonize our curriculum, by which is usually meant to put further works by non-white and non-Euro-American authors on the reading list. Now, anthropology could argue that it's been combating Eurocentrism from the very beginning, that this is and has always been its raison d'etre. True though that might be, as a response, it would be to miss the point. Anthropology cannot deal itself a get-out-of-jail-free card to avoid all introspection and reflexivity. It needs to face the calls for more diverse voices, just like other disciplines, as many anthropologists recognized quite some time ago. In any case, if what we want is more theory from the South, What I offer today is some ideas from South Asia. And I'd just like to go briefly off script here, because I just spent an hour listening to people share their memories of the anthropologist David Graeber, who died tragically young, exactly 2 weeks ago. Very moving it was too. I only met David a couple of times, and the first time was when he came up to Oxford to give one of our departmental seminars, and he was, I was expecting the aggressive, leather-jacketed anarchist of rumour, but of course he was the very opposite of that. He was gentle, he was kind, he was very approachable, and he gave one of the bravura performances of the last decade, I would say, from our departmental seminars. Anyway, I think all anthropologists are in his debt for putting anthropology on the map and showing just how relevant anthropology still can be. So, if we, as a discipline or a family of related and neighbouring disciplines, want to know what religion is, we should engage closely with the concepts that have been evolved in one of the most religiously fertile regions of the world. Those concepts are to be found not just in classical texts and ideas from the region, but also in the daily practice of ordinary South Asians. In doing so, I am approaching the question from the opposite direction to many anthropologists today who work in the now flourishing subfield of the anthropology of Christianity. Janet Hoskins has suggested that anthropologists and historians have succeeded in provincializing Europe, but have not yet managed to provincialize Christianity. What I am suggesting is that if, for a change, we described Christianity using concepts derived from Indic religious traditions rather than the other way around, we might make some progress both in making the familiar strange and in constructing a truly comparative anthropology of religions. As a way into the subject, let me start with two slightly easier examples. Shaman and taboo are specific notions that did not come out of Euro-America, but from Siberia and the Pacific, respectively. They have evolved into cross-cultural concepts that may be applicable anywhere. Scholars, quite rightly, debate the definitions, go back to early sources, and question the applicability of the concept in particular contexts. As far as I know, no one has argued that there should be a complete moratorium on using the term shaman outside of Siberia, though certainly anthropologists in the British tradition have been very hesitant to use the term in Africa, and others have expressed doubts about whether the concept is coherent in the way it is frequently used inside and outside the academy. My argument is that the same intellectual process of sifting and reflexive adaptation has not properly been done, or rather has been started but not completed, with the concept religion. On the one hand, religion is assumed by many to be universal. It's just something that in one form or another all humans have, even when they claim to be anti-religious. But on the other, it seems to take very different forms in different places. A small library could be formed of the books trying to pin down, without success or at least any widespread agreement, the definition of the phenomenon. The currently hegemonic understanding of the term religion, hegemonic in the sense that it dominates in the legal and political regimes of truth and knowledge that animate nation states and international law, derives from the Abrahamic tradition, specifically from Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. In the past, to have a religion was to belong to one of these traditions. Not to belong was to be, quote unquote, pagan, with a kind of prescriptural lesser form of religion. Proper religion had a prophet founder, or possibly a series of such prophets, a belief in an almighty and jealous God, a scripture, a set of moral injunctions, sacred buildings and religious specialists, and a clear boundary enacted and policed through ritual between believers and non-believers. Thanks to that very specific history and set of assumptions about what religion is, we are able to talk about religions as a faith, to think about religions as a set of beliefs, and to assume that religion is about belief in God or gods. Many of my colleagues, usually those whose own research is mainly to do with Euro-America, continue to do this, often relatively unreflexively. All of these are questionable assumptions when we start to approach the religions of Asia or other non-Abrahamic parts of the world. So far, I assume this is familiar and predictable ground. My proposal is to dispose of the conventional concept of religion and replace it, or break it down, into three distinct elements. This proposal is derived, of course, from my training as a scholar of South Asia and builds on the work of many other South Asian scholars, chief among them my doctoral supervisor, Richard Gombrich. My approach is not to try and define what religion is, but rather to see what it does and to see how the different kinds of doing religion fit together. or not, as the case may be. Okay, next slide, please. Let me start with 5 propositions, really my conclusions, stated boldly and with little elaboration. First, religion is 3 things, not 1. And what I mean will become clear, I hope, in what follows. And these 3 things operate, as I will explain, in characteristically different spaces and in characteristically different relationships to the human body. Number 2, different quote-unquote needs can be satisfied by different religions. Many people may be allergic to this kind of functionalist language, but it is now resurgent in the many evolutionary and other kinds of study of religion. Third, since the 19th century, reform movements have moved Asian religions closer to the Protestant model. And I'll say more about this, of course. Number 4, modernization increases the gap between the public affiliations that are listed in the census on the one side and the everyday on the other, mainly because public affiliations become mandatory in a way that they often were not before the nation state became the universal norm. 5, in spite of this long history of reform and purification, most Asians still live in a polytropic universe. Polytropy is a very felicitous term introduced by Michael Carruthers, which has caught on because it so obviously provides a name for a very real phenomenon, namely the kind of Asian universe that presupposes many powers and dangers, all of which should be propitiated by the wise person, and which may require different specialists, the full range of which should be employed by those who can afford it. In other words, the key thing is propitiation and polytheism. There is little or no concern with consistency across all spheres of life, what Max Weber called rationalization. Mark Chavez, in an address to the Society for the Scientific Study of Religion, called this the search for congruence. All right, next slide, please. So I call the 3 aspects, or 3 radically different ways of approaching religion, R1, R2, and R3, or soteriology, or that's to say salvation religion, social and communal religion, and instrumental religion. So let's start from the bottom up, as it were. So R3, or instrumental religion, covers activities that posit supernatural beings, what some now call parahumans, and humans' relations with them are mostly about misfortune. R2, I call social or communal religion. It's about rituals and attitudes that focus on society, in short, about belonging. In this perspective, the supernaturals are guarantors of, expressions of, or ways of talking about social arrangements. Finally, there are salvation religions, R1, which disregard or downgrade the supernaturals and focus on a transcendent God or principle. Given that theories of religion usually focus on one or other of these very different stances, it's not surprising that they often talk past each other. A major recent work of sociological history or historical sociology that I believe to be entirely consistent with my approach is Alan Strathern's Unearthly Powers, Religious and Political Change in World History. Building on the work of many illustrious forebears, Jaspers, Eisenstadt, Bella, Taylor, Assmann, and many more, Strathern posits a fundamental difference between transcendent and immanent religious worldviews. Societies that have transcendent religion also have immanent religion, but not necessarily the other way around. This means that he posits something like Karl Jasper's axial age, the key period between 700 and 400 before the Common Era, when transcendence entered the world, so to speak, discovered separately by the Buddha and other Indian sages in South Asia, by Confucius, Lao Tzu, and others in China, by the Greek philosophers in the Mediterranean, and by Zoroaster in Persia. Strathern's term transcendent religion corresponds to my soteriology, or R1. Strathern is a historian concerned to explain sacred kinship and historical change. For his purpose, the transcendent immanent contrast is enough. For my purposes as an ethnographer and anthropologist, I need to go further and distinguish within the category of immanent religion between the very different ends of R2, social religion or belonging, and R3, instrumental religion or misfortune. I think it's fair to say that the world of immanentist religion is a polytropic world and vice versa. Essentially, these are different terminologies for talking about the same thing. Okay, next slide, please. So anthropologists and humanities scholars generally frequently respond to the discovery of conceptual difference by declaring that X does not exist. Kinship has come in for this a lot. Around the same time, on different sides of the Atlantic, both Needham and Schneider declared that kinship did not exist. Adam Cooper did the same with primitive society, and Anthony Good with the Dravidian kinship system. One may reasonably ask oneself, how is it possible that so many books of deep scholarship have been written about so many non-existent objects? Okay. Next slide, please. Religion is not far behind. Plenty of scholars, both a considerable way in the past and more recently, have followed Cantwell Smith in denying that there is a single thing, certainly not a natural kind, corresponding to the label. The claim that there is no such thing as religion is different, of course, from the claim that a specific culture or tradition had no word for religion. Thus, Verblowski et al. Inform us that the Hebrew language originally had no equivalent to religion. When a word for religion became necessary, a loan word derived from Persian, that, came into use. Thus, many have felt that the thing exists, even if it is not named. Cantwell Smith was tempted by the idea that, quote, the rise of the concept religion is in some ways correlated with a decline in the practice of religion itself. Even where the word existed, as in ancient Rome, the meaning was quite different. In fact, it seems to have meant something rather similar to, and just as polysemous as, the word dharma in South Asia. It was his survey of the changing meaning of the word over the centuries that led Cantwell Smith to the conclusion that, quote, the word and the concepts should be dropped. Next slide, please. It's definitely correct, especially in this field, that essentialism should be contested. Just as methodological nationalism has rightly been criticized in migration studies and sociology, the same solecism at a lower scale could and should be called methodological ethnicism. And even though they haven't used that term, anthropologists, of course, have indeed contested it for many years. In the field of religious studies, it could be named methodological religionism. Indeed, methodological religionism could be said to be the driving impetus for the very creation of the field of religious studies. The way religious studies lines up different world religions and compares them has led to a series of root and branch critiques by authors such as Russell T. McCutcheon, Tomoko Masazawa, and Timothy Fitzgerald. They argue that religious studies is the product of a particular history motivated by particular interests. Within anthropology, the same kind of deconstruction has been conducted by Talal Asad. There are good reasons to think that a proclivity towards essentialism is an adaptive evolutionary mechanism, as Rita Astuti, drawing on the work of psychologist Susan Gellner, argued in her ASA 2018 keynote lecture. Psychological essentialism is necessary for learning language and acquiring concepts, as well as for interacting with the natural world. In Astuti's words, quote, psychological essentialism is an evolved disposition, and essentializing is something that human minds spontaneously do. However, as we know, and as children have to learn, even though sometimes useful, essentialism is also often deceptive. And of course, deconstructing essences taken for granted by other people has kept an awful lot of us social science academics in business for an awful long time. That critique of religious studies by Masuzawa et al. Is still valid today. Increasing numbers of religious studies scholars accept the force of it and are willing to allow that religion is not a universal natural kind. For example, this is how Eleanor Nesbitt recommends that religious studies teachers in schools should adopt an ethnographic approach precisely because it helps to avoid essentialism. So this is what she says, quote, an ethnographic approach to the teaching and study of religions reduces the risk of assuming religions to be bounded, static, internally homogeneous, depersonalized entities, and of presenting them in this reified and essentialized way. Of course, needless to say, such an approach has to be one that encourages the ethnographer to be alert to the ways that boundaries are crossed and categories are conflated in actual practice. Right, next slide, please. I want fairly rapidly now to list 5 different lessons that Asia can teach us about religion. The first has already been flagged. What we call religion covers at least 3 different kinds of activity. Of course, they are often connected. There may be crossovers or unclear cases, but there are also many cultural contexts in which the 3 types are conceptualized as quite distinct from each other, and that is particularly likely to be so in Buddhist Asia. By and large, these 3 types of activity are recognized as distinct by the people who are doing them. In South Asia, R1 is usually called a path or a way, pant, yana, marg, a vehicle or a boat to cross the sea of ordinary existence. The word that Westerners most readily associate with religion in South Asia, dharma, can mean either R1 or R2 today. My hunch is that in the distant past, it was more readily associated with R2. The term kul dharma or family dharma encompasses everything included under R2. There is a learned term for R3, namely kamya rights, but no single vernacular or colloquial term to the best of my knowledge. She does not organize it like this, and it is bordering on the absurd to reduce her superbly rich ethnographic account of village Hinduism to my schema. But Anna Grodzind-Gold's analysis of 3 different types of Hindu pilgrimage in her classic monograph, fruitful journeys, the ways of Rajasthani pilgrims, can be made to fit the three types almost exactly. There are more local pilgrimages that are judged by efficacy. Quote, do the deities deliver what is asked of them, i.e. R3. There are pilgrimages to the Ganges to submerge the bones of the ancestors. On return, there is, quote, communal celebration evoking vitality and fertility, i.e. R2. And then third, there is finally simple wandering that takes humans, quote, to crossing places where divine beneficence and even release are more readily available, i.e. R1. Okay, next slide, please. On the analytical level, we can map or diagram the three types as shown in the slide. You will see that Alan Strathern's immanent transcendent contrast is here labeled worldly versus otherworldly religion. Okay, next slide, please. Next slide, please. Well, anyway, I'll continue even without the next slide. A quick mnemonic for the three types. There we go, thank you. A quick mnemonic for the three types is Weber, Durkheim, Fraser. Or if you want alliteration, I owe this to David Parkin, Salvation Society spells. Weber theorized and typologized about everything, but his supreme achievement was to produce world historical comparisons on the social effects or lack of effects of particular soteriologies, or R1. Durkheim was aware of the existence of soteriologies and of instrumental religion or magic, of course, but as a great reductionist, everything ended up going through the single sausage grinder of society. In the inimitable words of Evans Pritchard, it was Durkheim and not the savage who made society into a god. Personally, I'm not so sure. Detailed ethnographies of Newar collective life in Nepal by Gérard Toffin and Robert Levy show how rich cosmologies collectively enacted offer a kind of salvation through social action by playing one's part in the collective choreography of the city. Reflective participants are very conscious that society is doing the orchestration. One of the Bhaktapur interlocutors of Levy's student Stephen Parish and Newar Brahmin told Parish directly, society is a god. The second lesson from Asia is that these different types or purposes do not have to be provided by one single ritual or ideological system, by one religion in the conventional sense. The Japanese represent arguably the most extreme case of functional differentiation, with 7 different contexts, in each of which a different religious system or combination of systems is responsible. Of course, when you consult specialists on Japanese religion, they tell you it's far more complicated than that. But anyway, as an outsider, I have a long footnote on this about Ron Dorr to back it up. In Japan, it's possible to identify 4 different levels of expressing and creating belonging, from the household up to the nation. These are different forms of R2, and they are provided either by Buddhism or by Shintoism or by both. R3, instrumental religion, is provided by Buddhism, Shintoism and Taoism in competition with each other. In other words, there's a free market for solutions in a polytropic universe. R1 is provided overwhelmingly by Buddhism. The ethical code is provided mainly by Confucianism, though that came to Japan under the umbrella of Buddhism. Okay, next slide, please. As many observers of Japan have pointed out, most ordinary Japanese do not stop to think, is what I'm doing Buddhist, Shinto, or something else? It's just not a problem that occurs to them. The same applies to China, about which Adam Chow writes, quote, the biggest problem with attempts at mapping religions in China is that it is modeled on a confessional, affiliational understanding of mutually exclusive religious membership. In an important sense, the whole point of this book, that's the one that you can see there on the slide, is to argue against this kind of misunderstanding. I am fully in agreement with the main thrust of Chow's argument, and I like very much his 5 modalities of doing religion, which you can see listed there: discursive scriptural, personal cultivational, liturgical, immediate practical, and relational. But I am less comfortable with his wholesale dismissal of the affiliation categories, Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, etc. Rather, I would say that making claims about numbers and affiliation has become a 6th modality of doing religion, one that is frequently intimately connected to issues of identity and politics. Obviously, I'm going to come back to this. Next slide, please. Over a century ago, Chow's key point about the irrelevance of the confessional model of religions in Asia was put brilliantly by the great French Sanskritist and historian Sylvain Lévy. In my translation of his French, as inheritors of Greek logic and Jewish monotheism, we instinctively apply the principle of contradiction to religious beliefs. And he goes, for us, gods and worshippers are classified in closed sets, which we consider exclusive to the point of antagonism. Statisticians, proceeding in a laughably literal-minded manner, calculate the total number of Buddhists, Confucians, or Shintoists. An Indian, a Chinaman, or a Japanese would be incapable of understanding them. Okay, next slide, please. Another case of functional differentiation is provided by the classic structuralist analysis of Stanley Tambaya in his Buddhism and the Spirit Cults in northeast Thailand. The argument is summed up in the famous diagram on page 338. It shows how there are 4 different contrasting ritual complexes for different purposes that make up the local religion. And Tambaya plausibly treats them as contrasting aspects of a single carefully structured whole. Tambaya stresses that this, quote, is not a conscious model on the part of the villagers. Rather, as is usual in Theravada countries, they view the different parts as separate and opposed traditions. Each complex has its own specialists and its own language of ritual, though there are overlaps and mutual influences. Buddhism is dominant and provides the overall framework of values. It provides for R1 and some of R2, but is kept separate from R3 most of the time. It provides powerful protection, but not specific remedies. A parallel in the Islamic world would be Michael Lambeck's analysis of religious practices in Mayot in terms of 3 distinct contexts and discourses. 1, Islam, 2, cosmology or worldly knowledge, and 3, spirit possession. Despite Lambeck's emphatic disagreement with Tambaya on the question of the systems available to the foreign anthropologist with his or her sophisticated intellectual technology, Lambeck's material could be subjected to a similar analysis. Just as in Thailand, the people of Mayot do not see these different traditions as forming a single system. The difference here is that in Lambeck's case, the anthropologist agrees with the people. Okay, next slide, please. So lesson number 3 is about reconstruction in a Protestant direction. In societies less dominated by Buddhism than Thailand, societies such as Japan and China and South Asia, the vast majority of people are not interested in classifying themselves as followers of one or other religion. But that begins to change in the modern period for both internal reasons to do with reform movements among specialists and external reasons often to do with the politics of ethnicity, nationalism, and anti-colonial struggle. A process of reconstruction begins that makes the religions increasingly begin to resemble, at least outwardly, the modernist or Protestant model. Anagarika Dharmapala, the great Sinhalese nationalist and Buddhist reformer, was particularly interested in pushing Sinhalese Buddhism in this direction. One of the key points about Theravada Buddhism is that the monk is not a priest, even though that English word is often used for them. Traditionally, the system remained probably the purest soteriology we know, with the possible exception of Jainism. Traditionally, there was no wedding ceremony in Theravada Buddhism because marriage was thought to have nothing to do with Buddhism or religion, which was purely to do with the afterlife and salvation. Weddings, therefore, were a purely non-religious matter. Mahayana Buddhism is different. At least among the Newas, a wedding ceremony is a part of the tradition, and you can see a photograph of one there on the top left of the slide. With the spread of the broadly Abrahamic and specifically Protestant notion of what a religion is, there arose a felt need for a Theravada wedding ceremony, and one has duly been invented. Likewise, Buddhist catechisms were invented by Colonel Olcott, as well as a Buddhist flag, which is now caught on throughout the Buddhist world. Okay, next slide, please. So the 4th lesson from Asia. The point here is that the process of modernization and nation-state formation leads to a widening gap between public labels and assertions of belonging on the one side and everyday practice on the other. With the start of the decennial censuses at the beginning of the 1950s in Nepal, and the obligation to choose one and only one religious category of affiliation, and the consequent politicization of categories of identity, the tension, which was very mild or non-existent before 1950 between everyday practice and categorical belonging, gradually increased. From 1990 onward, several groups in Nepal, such as the Gurungs, Magas, and Tharus, tried to redefine themselves as Buddhists rather than Hindus, and the tensions in some households became quite acute, although it would be wrong to imagine them as severe or widespread in the country as a whole. The leaders of the Magas were particularly unified and effective in this regard. They decided that, for political reasons, they wished Magas to be returned in the census as Buddhist, because they did not want to support Brahmin hegemony, and they therefore needed to get out from under the umbrella of Hinduism and give up their use of Brahmin priests. In fact, The history of the Mughals over the last 200 to 300 years before this decision is one of deep Hinduization. This rejection of Hinduism for political reasons to do with caste and entrenched inequality has much in common with the Ambedkarite movement among Dalits in India. However, that is a link with Dalits that the Mughal activists are not particularly keen to play up. In any case, the Mughal activists seek to remodel Mughal religious practice, especially those life cycle rituals for which they used to call a Brahmin priest, in a Buddhist direction, by training up Mughal officiants and providing them with liturgical handbooks derived from contemporary Theravada Buddhist practice. A similar movement is also occurring among the Tarus, a tribal group in the Terai Plains bordering India and also across the border in India. And these movements have been studied in detail by Chiara Letizia. I turn now to some evidence produced by research on religion in the Nepali diaspora in the UK. Although based in the diaspora, there's every reason to believe that the findings about home shrines of Nepalis in the UK would apply just as much to migrants in Kathmandu or other cities in Nepal. In research on Nepali shrines among Mughals or Gurungs in the UK, the man of the house would often state, "We are Buddhist." Then at the end of the interview, we would ask, would you mind if we looked at and photographed your family's household shrine? And then we're looking at it, there would be a lot of Hindu gods. Now, in itself, that's not a sign of contradiction. It's perfectly possible and not contradictory for Buddhists to worship Hindu gods. But the tension was often a sign of the gendered division of labor and of a considerable gap between census classification and practice. And in the photograph on the bottom right, you can see the two shrines belonging to one household that was formally identified as Buddhist. One shrine contained numerous Hindu godmen and some Hindu gods. The other was Buddhist. Clearly, everyday practice was both Buddhist and Hindu, even if the census affiliation was Buddhist. And the photograph on the bottom left was a Sunawar household that was happy to claim a threefold religious identity as Kirat, Buddhist, and Hindu all at once. And yet, if one went on the evidence of the shrine alone, one would have classified them as Hindu. And top right, a possibly unique example, where the owner of the shrine was a Catholic, but his wife was a devotee of Sai Baba, hence Sai Baba in the heart of Jesus. In the eloquent words of the owner of the shrine himself, Nepal Dan Rai, he said, "There are no restrictions on religion in my family. They can become Buddhist, Muslim, Kirat, and so on. I want to see their happiness just like me. I am a happier person since I became a Christian. I would not stop my son becoming Muslim if he believed that it was for him. In my opinion, we do religious practice to feel happy. My wife feels happy when she does Sai Baba bhajan," that's hymn singing. "So I do not stop her doing this, and I do not like to take away her happiness. This is my philosophy of life. I believe in democracy, and I want to see democracy in religion as well." Okay, next slide, please. This brings me to my fifth lesson from Asia. Despite all the pressures and the purifications which have been going on for a long time from the 19th century already, and with increasing intensity throughout the 20th, most Asians still live in a very polytropic universe. The key symbols are often multivalent. Carithers defines polytropy as a name for the, quote, eclecticism and fluidity of South Asian religious life, which is thoroughly social. The consumers of religion actively turn to persons such as gods and goddesses or living divine persons, or even living persons such as priests or mediums. Polytropy covers many qualities of religious relationship, unquote. And these relations are hierarchical and expressed through worship. They're often dynamic, practical, and interactive, and so on. Now, a good example from Nepal will be the god most widely known as Matsyendranath, a Hindu sage, a Nathpanthi yogi. But the inner identity is actually Karanamaya Avalokiteshvara, the bodhisattva of compassion in Mahayana Buddhism. And beneath that, he is called also Bungadyo, the god of the village of Bungamati, who brings the monsoon rains on which local farmers depend. A very similar example from Sri Lanka will be Kataragama, a god who is worshipped by Buddhists, Hindus, and Muslims alike. Okay, next slide, please. Most Westerners, even when practicing Eastern religions, and even when they think they are rejecting their Abrahamic background, import assumptions about unitary belonging and exclusivism. I was very struck by this form that I came across that attempts to recruit followers to a Tibetan Buddhist practice, which explicitly instructs them to tick one box only. I am pretty sure that Tibetan Buddhists accumulate different initiations and practices in a spirit of the more the merrier, and that the one and only one box injunction is foreign to the spirit of ordinary Tibetan Buddhism. Okay, next slide, please. Since I have approached religion primarily as something that is done rather than a set of beliefs, it should come as no surprise that ritual too has to be disaggregated into exactly the same three types. Now, Humphrey and Laidlaw have wrote some time back now, a well-regarded and insightful book, The Archetypal Actions of Ritual, which made many important and useful points about ritual and how it works. But they failed to engage with the indigenous South Asian tradition of ritual exegesis, and crucially failed to recognize that the archetype on which their theory is based, individual Jain puja, is just one part of a complex field, one type of ritual in a universe that encompasses many different types carried out with different intentions. They could make their argument that ritual is a kind of action disconnected from intention in the everyday sense because they focused on one type, namely ritual that is expressive, soteriological, and individual. They ignored much of what I call R2 and the entirety of what I call R3, as well as the whole history of struggle and debate between different South Asian modes of religiosity, in which the renouncer religions, such as Buddhism and Jainism, defined themselves through and in terms of their rejection both of Brahminical theories of ritual and simultaneously of the transactional assumptions of most R3 Hindu religiosity. Interestingly, though theirs is a very different kind of theory, it shares an individualist bias with Charles Taylor's approach in A Secular Age, a book which otherwise is a philosophical reworking of a highly Weberian position. I have a lot of sympathy. That individualist bias comes from approaching their subject matter, ritual in one case, the place of religion in everyday life in the other, from their unconscious prioritization of R1 over all other manifestations of the religious field. Okay, next slide, please. Schematically, it's possible to distinguish the three types spatially on 2 and then 3 dimensions. In the first case, we can differentiate them by whether the point of them is this worldly or otherworldly, and second, by diffuse versus specific aims. So if we look at the diagram on the left first, R1 soteriology or salvation religion may aim either at a very specific otherworldly end, or at vaguer, more diffuse well-being in an otherworldly sense. R3, by contrast, aims at specific worldly benefits. I want grandma to get better, or I want rain to fall tomorrow, etc. R2 aims at more diffuse worldly benefits, social solidarity, generalized well-being. We can then add in the third dimension, group versus individual. That gives us a diagram on the right. R2 is classically and stereotypically collective. R3, much more individualistic. So R2 and R3 end up at opposite corners, diagonally opposite corners of the ground floor, the this worldly base of the cube. R1 floats around in the otherworldly atmosphere, mainly towards the front or more individualistic side of the cube. Of course, these are ideal types, effectively a model, to use a very old-fashioned term. In reality, there are plenty of hybrids. R1 movements, of which South Asia has many, so many that some scholars have doubted that Hinduism is a coherent category, arise in opposition to existing practices of R2 and R3 and often define themselves, as I have said, by that opposition. One highly important point is that R1 doctrines, once established and having a specified set of followers, are a very powerful means of generating social solidarity, so that there are numerous examples of soteriological doctrines becoming the key marker of ethnic or national identity. And as Dumont argued, classic renouncer movements of South Asia, initially focused on R1, end up defining the social identity of a caste or group of castes, so that R1 is routinized into R2. This means that classic R2 rituals, life cycle rituals, for example, especially for men, are frequently cast in a soteriological idiom or narrative. Thai men spending time as a monk in order to be classically fully adult, for example. Similarly, the commemoration of soteriologically significant events quickly becomes appropriated for Durkheimian or R2 ends, cf. Christmas or regular Sunday worship in most forms of Christianity. On a darker tone, the identification of particular minority communities with specific R1 doctrines not shared by the majority sharpens the boundary between the outgroup and the majority, with the tragic consequences that we see today in Xinjiang, Kashmir, and throughout South Asia. Next slide, please. And if you're worried that you've seen these pictures before, don't worry, you have. Okay, so there are, as I've said, spatial and social implications of these different types. R3 is characteristically carried on in private, usually within the home, either of the patient sponsor or of the healer shaman. There may be occasional rainmaking rituals carried on collectively and in public, but these are rare. R3 rituals are usually about as private as it is possible to be in a society where very little is truly private. R2 rituals, by contrast, are often carried on in public. Even when basically taking place within a household, there is often or usually a public aspect, for example, a procession around the locality as part of the ritual. In the case of life cycle rituals, they are performed not only in order to bring about a change of status, but also to proclaim that status in public. Contrast that with the R3 instrumental rituals, which typically people hope to keep private. Festivals and communal rites a fortiori take place in public and in designated space, either sacred buildings or space that is sanctified for the occasion. R1 soteriological rituals are both public and private. Sometimes they are the private act of the individual, observed by no one and supposed to be observed by no one, prayer or meditation, for example. At other times, they are collective and public, as in a Catholic Mass or Buddhist alms round, or in listening to a sermon by a Jain teacher. Seekers on the path may share their efforts, and very often do, and in that case, they take place in those spaces that are publicly designated as sacred, or designed for such soteriological purposes. But despite all the brotherhood or sisterhood on the path, it remains in the last resort an overwhelmingly individual one. Furthermore, soteriology is powerfully connected to marginal or liminal spaces. It is in those spaces that the seeker finds the insight and or the power to provide a critique of the world and to offer a path out of it. Mindful of Kim Nott's argument that we must place the body at the center of the study of space, I am tempted to make the following argument. To postulate that the three orientations have characteristically different stances on the body. R3 seeks to heal or benefit the physical body, R2 to transform, as in life cycle rituals, the social body, or to unite it with others, as in festivals, or to benefit it generally, but not specifically, as R3 does. And R1 seeks to transcend the body, or at least, and I'm thinking of paths like Taoism here, to transcend the normal understanding of the body by revealing its hidden meanings and potentials. Shepard, Hughes and Locke famously posited the three bodies, the individual self, the social body and the body politic, to which my colleague Elizabeth Sue has offered a fourth, the body ecologic. From my point of view, these can be lined up with the three types, in that the first is the sphere of R1 and R3 and the others of R2. As a specialist on South Asia, I should also observe that the three orientations form a hierarchy, one that will be recognized by most South Asians. Where all three exist, even when they are not provided by the same system, R1 is clearly given the highest value, even if, as noted, it is so often routinized or enmeshed in imminent concerns. As such, it encompasses, in a specifically Dumontian sense, the worldly orientations of the other spheres, even though it may appear to be a minority pursuit honored most often in the breach. It is also important to note that these are not static categories. If we accept that there is some kernel of truth in the axial age idea, it is clear that R1 is a later development and indeed is developed in conscious reaction to existing forms of R2 and R3. Whether R3 is the original form of religion, as Fraser thought, or R2, as Durkheim argued, need not detain us here. Okay, next slide, please. Let me provide one fairly random example of common approaches that ignore the typology I'm putting forward. In this quotation from Atran and Norenzen, they assert that all religions believe in metahuman or supramundane powers, and all societies endorse through ritual counterintuitive beliefs about them. What these generalizing views omit is the idea that transcendent religions reject conventional views of spirits and spread countervailing attitudes and approaches to them, including the views that spirits don't exist, or if they do exist, that they don't matter. Confucianism, if I've understood correctly, is the view that rituals have to be done even though the spirits to which they're directed don't exist or don't matter, and I think such an attitude was common among the elite of the Roman Empire. In short, I offer some free and very friendly advice to cognitive and evolutionary anthropologists of religion. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. If evolutionary anthropologists really are falling into the trap of methodological religionism, that is, essentializing religion, if they are exemplifying the tendency to essentialize that is an evolved predisposition of humankind, that is somewhat ironic. We are not constrained to do so. My suggestion is that we are likely to find different cognitive mechanisms at work, both in the transmission memory of tradition and in interactions with parahuman entities, depending on which of the three spheres we are talking about. Only by distinguishing them are we going to come up with a comprehensive theory. Okay, next slide, please. To round up, I give you this section, but not the whole lecture. I give you my 5 propositions again. The key thing is that religion is not one thing, but 3. And as in all anthropological inquiry, and indeed regardless of anthropology, if we want to understand the world we live in as such, we must keep the distinction between public political categories and everyday practice firmly in mind. Endless confusion, where participants simply talk past each other, is created by failing to do so. But if you've followed me thus far, there arises a pressing and obvious question. Why has the erroneous view been so powerful? Why in so many places has the jealous Abrahamic God idea managed to push out what one might call humans' natural polytropic tendencies? This is a huge question that I can't totally resolve now, of course, but I will give some indication of where I think the answer lies, although obviously I'm going to have to paint with a very broad brush. Next slide, please. First, I believe it is an ethnographic fact that religion is the last bastion of purity thinking, even in the UK today. As evidence, I advance the categories of the 2011 census. In the question on ethnicity, you can see from the slide how the number of mixed identities has multiplied over the decades. Even though one can only tick one box, at least multiple identities are recognized. Now, in the question on nationality, by contrast, one was positively encouraged to tick more than one box. The state wanted people to identify both as Scottish and as British, for example. But in the question on religion, they wanted one and only one box ticked, and no multiple identities were offered. I actually rang the census helpline and I asked the woman who answered what would happen if one ticked more than one answer in the religion question. And she said, "Oh, I don't know about that. I'll have to ask." When she asked, the answer was no. Anyone who ticked more than one box would have only the first taken into account. Even when the Office of National Statistics recognised that essentialism is wrong in the spheres of national or ethnic belonging, it remains when we are talking about religion. Now, of course, to say all this is just to re-describe the problem and not answer the question that I've posed myself. So a first approximation is to say that the Enlightenment, even though many of its advocates were hostile either to all organized religion or even to religion as such, still retained the same concept of religion as their opponents. But we may well want to go further back into the history of Christianity and Islam, as well as into the contrast with Buddhism, and forward to the history of nationalism. In contemplating this question, I've come to agree rather strongly with Adrian Hastings when he says at the opening of his book, The Construction of Nationhood, that considering the four concepts of religion, nation, ethnicity, and nationalism, it's impossible to write the history of any one of the four without fully taking into account the other three. Okay, next slide, please. The world has seen many soteriologies, but only three have been hugely successful as missionary religions spreading over large areas in many different cultures: Buddhism, Christianity, and Islam. Between them, they claim more than half of the world's population today and far outstrip the adherents of any other named religion. All three stand in sharp contrast to the inherited pagan backgrounds of religions of their time, the time when they emerged. All three require a rejection or reworking or transvaluation of values on the part of those who convert. Buddhism is different from the other two in not sharing the jealous Abrahamic God. Buddhism also incorporates a hierarchical vision in the sense that, while it stands for the equality of opportunity of all human beings, it does not posit an equality of respect for everyone at the same moment. This may sound harsh, but in Buddhism, gifts given to the spiritually advanced are far more meritorious than gifts given to beggars. In the other two soteriologies, by contrast, all believers are spiritually equal in a significant sense, for all that huge hierarchies existed and still exist in practice, and for all that they too develop differentiated hierarchies of merit for donations. In short, only the Abrahamic two have sought to obliterate the distinction between the three types of religion. And of course, in practice, even they had to compromise in many contexts. I've already indicated very briefly in my discussion of the Protestantization of Buddhism how traditional forms of Buddhism have been very largely transformed by the impact of Western understandings of religion. And I believe the same argument could be made about Islam as well. Now, in trying to explain the power of in particular institutional forms that obliterate the distinctions between R1, R2, and R3, and that try to insist that all such purposes must be provided by one all-encompassing religious system that rejects all competitors as false, I do feel a bit like David Hume, who struggled to provide sociological and historical explanations for the fact that beneficial results, what he saw as very beneficial results, liberty and toleration, could flow from and be encouraged by the religious trends that he personally found so distasteful, and which he described using terms such as zealotry, enthusiasm, and fanaticism. Anyway, nonetheless, I shall try. And as I say, this is in the broadest strokes. So let me list them. First, there's the monopolistic tendencies of the Christian church, whether that's in relation to the supernatural, Keith Thomas, or landowning, Jack Goody. And those tendencies were encouraged by the Peace of Westphalia, which carved Europe up into zones of influence for different churches. And it's not a coincidence, I believe, that 1648 is seen as the key turning point for the creation of modern nation states as well. And these tendencies built, of course, on the foundation of the jealous God of the Old Testament. After the Reformation, the same God escaped the control of the Church of Rome, but remained an aspiration even when reduced to the level of the individual. See Dumont, German ideology. Many early forms of nationalism in Europe, which on most accounts at least formed the model for the development of nationalism elsewhere, took the chosen people of the Old Testament as their inspiration. And this is where Adrian Hastings, whose book is shown there on the slide, is my guide. Religious affiliation may not always be the determining factor in nationalism, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, but in many other cases it's pretty decisive. Even where the state is formally secularist, there are powerful forces seeking to define national belonging in religious terms, Turkey, India. All these historical influences come together to create a post-Enlightenment common sense view written into law and into the structure of people's lives, supporting the unitary religion assumption alongside the unitary nation assumption. On the one hand, a centralizing ideological package that combines R1, R2, and R3 and excludes competitors is extremely attractive both to rulers and to priests. On the other hand, when the separation of state and religion has occurred and instituted a somewhat free market in religious offerings, a package deal is also attractive to religious entrepreneurs who are then able to offer a complete and all-encompassing solution to the whole of life, as the example of the global success of Pentecostalism demonstrates. No wonder then that those who have high status within traditionalist Asian religions feel very threatened by the arrival of aggressively missionizing forms of Christianity that demolish the barriers between R1, R2, and R3 that underlie their existing social arrangements. Perhaps the problem looked at from another angle is, what are or were the conditions of possibility of religious monopolization by one organization? As Pascal Boyer has pointed out, all religious specialists attempt to turn themselves into a guild and to exclude the competition, but only a few guilds succeed. More often, one is left with the Chinese or South Asian polytropic situation in which a huge number of competing specialists jockey for position. It's striking that this was the case in China, even when China did have, as a clear ideal, and in periods even as an actually existing reality, a unitary, centralized, and bureaucratically organized society, unlike other parts of Asia. By contrast, political fragmentation in Europe encouraged small pockets of religious and national homogeneity. Clearly, in some situations in Asia, there was a greater degree of religious uniformity and control than in others, e.g. Tibet, Burma, Thailand, Japan in the Tokugawa period. However, in none of these situations before the modern period did religious hierarchies achieve anything like the hegemony of the Catholic Church in its heyday. Okay, next slide, please. This is my last slide. So I've offered a theory of religion in that I've suggested what it is and what it's not, and how to use the concept in a way that is informed by practice, but still offers grounds for generalization and comparison. I've offered a spatial theory that distinguishes the characteristic spaces, bodily attitudes, communal individual orientations, and purposes of different types of religion. And I've also suggested that these ideal types, or the model that they collectively constitute, should not be seen as static. Rather, the different elements of it are in a constant historical process of mutual self-definition and reconstitution. By effectively defining religion in terms of practices undertaken to satisfy these three basic human needs or purposes, one consequence, I suppose you could argue, that one consequence is at the limit, these needs could be satisfied by what conventionally would be regarded as non-religious means, e.g., for R1 seeking to write oneself into the record books, for R2 being a passionate follower of Liverpool Football Club, for R3 devoting oneself to the NHS. So I know that I accept that is one consequence. I have gestured towards Max Weber's great insight, subsequently elaborated by others, that one particular approach to R1 had a very deep elective affinity to the culture of modernity, to the extent that it may legitimately be seen as one of the ultimate causes that helped to bring that modernity into existence. This world historical importance of one particular absolutist form of R1, which I have referred to as Protestantization, is or maybe the major theme explaining the many ways in which the practical and ritual systems that we call religions have been reconstituted in the last 150 years. I have indicated thereby why it might be that two particular variants of R1 have come to dominate the world in which we live today. Now, for certain individuals, that domination, that victory, may be a Pyrrhic victory. And to see why, at the end, I return to my distinction between census affiliations or categories on one side and everyday practice on the other. Census classifications are not just opposed to practice, although they do indeed oppose it and are often in tension with it because they seek to remold it and reform the practice of the everyday. Categorization is itself a form of practice favored by activists, particularly those religious specialists or virtuosos who seek to reconstruct the whole of human life in terms of a single regulatory ideal. Ordinary life has a way of interrupting, however, as demonstrated in the subtle ethnography of Samuel Schilke in his book, Egypt in the Future Tense, an account of a small town in northern Egypt conducted over many years. The perspective of repeated visits and long engagement enables Schilke to track the attempts of one of his young male friends to embody and live out the Salafi Muslim ideal. His heroic attempts to remake himself, to impose on himself an iron discipline every day, to avoid cigarettes and other impious activities, and not just on himself. He tries to make his mother adopt, a peasant who has never done so, adopt the full face niqab. In the end, all these efforts founder and dissipate. This does not cause the young man concerned to lose faith in the legitimacy of Salafism as such. Quote, he felt that he had found the correct true Islam, but had failed to live it out. He had been happy, but now he was troubled. The demands of a jealous God and the appeals of a highly rationalized form of life run according to the dictates of an all-encompassing framework providing answers and rules for every circumstances. These evidently remain attractive ideals for many. But the complexities and diversity of human purposes, the unpredictability of events, the multifarious demands of the everyday, and the fact that R1 and R2 and R3 are all being forced into one single swag bag, all this means that life will always outrun the schemes designed to control it. In that sense, the baggy, hierarchical wisdom of South Asian polytropy may provide a more comfortable set of clothes for the exigencies of everyday life than the tight-fitting straitjacket of Abrahamic absolutism. Thank you for listening.
Professor Gellner, thank you so much indeed. This is the point at which a room would erupt with applause. And I wish I could replicate that for you. But I know that we've had over 170 people who have been listening into you this evening. And that really was the most tremendous tour de force. So thank you very much indeed. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some questions online, but please feel free to pop your questions onto the chat, and I'll do my best and can only apologize when my attempt to announce some of the words goes perhaps a little bit wrong. So if I can ask the first question, which comes from Fred Wojciechowski from the University of Cambridge. He is asking, relatedly, how does hierarchy fit with modernist purification movements?
The answer is badly. So it's it means that that a lot of these purification movements tie themselves up in quite a lot of knots, trying to maintain some kind of traditional hierarchies, but at the same time trying to be modern and egalitarian. So it creates tensions. Is the answer, and you can see that in many. And tensions over gender hierarchies, tensions over other kinds of spiritual hierarchies, it's, I suppose, the fundamental reason why you get so many splits in Protestant sects and so on, but also in other kind of religious movements.
Thank you. I've got a question from Domenico Copertino, which is the University of Basilicata. Are there issues that cross the three dimensions of religion? For example, the issue of power in religion. Are the authorities related to each dimension different?
Yes. Yeah, that's such a difficult and complex question, and I don't think I can give. If there is a possible general answer to that question, I certainly can't give it to you now. but and it, very much there's particular histories, and particularly, and this is why the Abrahamic situations is so unusual, I suppose, in world historical contrast. Why did why did the political authorities suddenly become so keen to stamp out women herbalists and brand them as witches at particular periods when they hadn't beforehand? Is in Europe, in different parts of Europe. That's something that historians and anthropologists of witchcraft have been arguing over for a long time. So, power. It's a very good question, and again, I think deserves much fuller response that I can possibly give here.
For another time, perhaps.
Yeah.
Marcus Banks from the University of Oxford did have his hand up, but has given me a statement, perhaps rather than a question. Protestantization is not a given. Some reject it. For example, the post-Reformation Catholics.
Yes, that is right. I mean, and that goes together with the kind of dialogic or view that I was trying to put forward, or dialectical, if you want to go back to that old-fashioned word, of religious developments. But of course the Catholics did adopt some of the Protestants' methods. They did, encouraging literacy in the vernacular, and they realized they had a big problem on their hands, and they went all out to combat it. So yes, you can see, and it's goes back to old Bates and schismogenesis, I guess. I remember going into a Catholic church in Montreal and thinking, my God, this church is designed in such a way as to annoy Protestants to the max. They have really gone all out to say that we're the opposite of that. But underneath that, there can be all kinds of Protestantizing trends, even though they're not called formally Protestant. And the same is true, obviously, of what Gombrich and Obisekra call Protestant Buddhism, or that others have called modernist Buddhism. It adopted the means of Protestantism in order to oppose it.
Thank you. I apologize for my pronunciation here, but Shobhikant Adhikari, who's from the Nepal Open University, has asked that he would like to ask you, what made you inspired to study the Nepalese culture, and what will be the benefit of the study to the respondents of the society?
Okay, well, that's not specifically about what I've just been talking about, but although, having said that, interest in these kinds of questions of understanding a very, very different approach to religion, and the approach to religion that undermines the received categories in which religion is described in the West did inspire my original PhD fieldwork, on which this lecture heavily draws, of course. So on the question of benefits, well, I've done many different types of research, which I hope will benefit Nepalese people in different ways. I do know that that since there's a very, very cheap paperback edition of the book of my PhD available in the main bookshops in Kathmandu, and this is not a commercial break, that a lot of my old Newa Buddhist friends do have a copy of it on their shelves. The number who've actually read it cover to cover is much smaller, of course, but it is appreciated, I think, and benefits other people will have to say.
Thank you. The Pika Kamra from the Jindal Global University is asking, where do religious political movements fit into these dimensions? Cases where religion is at the center of the political projects of nation and state building without a focus on beliefs necessarily.
Absolutely, this is a great question. Very, very, very germane to what I was saying. And of course, I was going skating very fast over very thin ice, so that I wouldn't fall into the water and get drowned at the end there. And I was trying to tackle that question. Of course, Peter van der Veer has written an excellent book about religious nationalism specifically in India on this very topic. And we see a very different kind of and much more vicious kind of nation building project taking place right now in India. Anybody who follows the news there will know. So yes, this is what I was trying to say, is that and I was quoting approvingly from Adrian Hastings, that if we want to understand the ideas of nation, the ideas of ethnicity, the ideas of nationalism, and the ideas of religion in the modern world, we have to take all four of them together. And too often nationalism has been studied without sufficient attention to religion, and too often I think the reform, or modernization of religion in the modern world has been tackled without simultaneously looking at nation building. And so, yes, I mean, it was Gandhi's genius to formulate a language that would enable Indians to live in a kind of pluralist society while continuing to be religious and continuing to be patriotic or nationalist Indians. The tragedy, I suppose, is that that language hasn't been modernized and updated, and is now being replaced by a much more chauvinist Hindu version.
Thank you. There are questions coming in thick and fast, so I'm going to do my best to get through as many as I can. Bhavesh Pradhan from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences in Mumbai has asked, in the case of newer people from Nepal, where does people's relation to land figure in the R1, R2, R3 spatial framework?
Oh, gosh. Well, R1, is not about, land, that's what I was saying. It's about individual salvation. Likewise, R3 is about, personal, the kind of immediate problems and responses to misfortune. So again, is usually not, I think one could think of some marginal cases and rituals and so on, but basically not. But R2 definitely is. Now our, cultural identity, now our national identity is absolutely tied up with, its relationship to a particular space in which the Newars are now a minority, and they're what's called in Africa a host tribe. That's to say, the Kathmandu Valley is their home territory, but they're not in control of it, and they're now a minority in it. And so the issue of land and identity is quite important, and so it will be very interesting to see. I mean, if officially and on paper, Nepal has signed up to ILO 169 and given permitted indigenous rights to an extent that is not paralleled anywhere else in Asia. But whether in practice those laws can be mobilized in a legal system where Newars are few and far between, and which is totally dominated by non-Newar, I doubt. But we will see. Time will tell.
Thank you. Joy Henry from Oxford Brookes. In Japan, Christianity has been added to R2 religious practices for weddings, even if it's not insisted that the practitioners be ordained Christians. Is this an example of an even more inclusive way?
Yeah, well, that's why I gave the Japanese as an example. I mean, they seem to be the most eclectic, as long as that worldview, their cosmology, continues. Yeah, it was, the year we spent in Japan, we actually, right just towards the end, we were invited to a wedding, and our son played the cello at it, and our daughter was asked to walk up to the improvised altar, to present the ring to the couple, and there was a New Zealander acting as the pastor for the occasion, and this is absolutely, extraordinary event, but it fits totally the traditional Buddhist. It's a very, there's absolutely, the Western impulse is always to say, oh, look at these people, they're so mixed up, they don't know what they're doing. No, on the contrary, they know exactly what they're doing. This fits perfectly with the traditional Buddhist worldview, that weddings have nothing to do with salvation. So you can be a good Buddhist and be married by a Christian pastor, no problem.
Fascinating. Yunxia Wu from my university in Lancaster has asked, is it necessary for the religious traditions to be connected with mental health field for the diaspora communities in the UK?
I don't know if it's necessary. It happens. I mean, they are connected, whether British health professionals want them to be or not. It's well attested that many diaspora populations do for R3. I mean, they obviously have the full panoply, and for R3 purposes, they do take resort to healers who are here, and I personally know a very powerful Nepalese shaman who was a British Gurkha, but is now settled in Ely, and his services are in high demand. So they're there, and and I think there are many professionals in the health. I occasionally get sort of notices and invitations to conferences which indicate that there are quite a few health professionals in this country who are aware of this fact and realize that this has to become part of their medical field.
Thank you. Wasim Hassan from University of Oxford, thank you for the intriguing presentation. What are the main criteria for a tribal religion, and do geography, climate, and location in which the religion emerged affect the three components mentioned?
I mean, tribe is a very difficult, contentious, and contested term, and there are anthropologists. In fact, quite some time ago, I think it was Aidan Southall who announced he was going to excise the word tribe from his vocabulary because it was an obnoxious term. And of course, you can't do that if you work in South Asia because it's an official legal term in India, and you have to use it. But anyway, if we accept for the moment, if you allow me to use the word tribal, I mean the position is, if you accept the Axial Age idea, the position is that tribal religion is consisted of R2 and R3, but not R1. Now this has been contested, and it can be quite powerfully contested. But anyway, that is the position. And I believe, there's a certain section of the Muggers, a small section called the Kham Muggers, who have their own language, who essentially their whole religion revolves around R3. They have shamans who do all these healing rituals, but they don't really have a kind of Durkheimian type social rituals. It's all very implicit. Anyway, so it's a very interesting case of a sort of very non-Durkheimian tribe, if we want to call them that. And so, but of course, prophets do arise among tribes, and they very often do arise at the time when the tribes are in contact with other groups, and when they're under pressure from other groups, when they're losing their land, or land's been taken away from them. So R3 definitely comes in, and they often, these prophets very often evolve either a brand new religion altogether, or some kind of, they take bits and pieces from the tribal heritage and rework them. And some of these movements take off and some don't. So, everything is in flux. But they certainly can present, there is the potential for all three types. They don't necessarily have to be, as I say, they do not have to be provided by the same conventional quote unquote religion.
Okay, thank you. This is a long question, so bear with me. This is from Isaac Stanley of Clays, who says, thank you, first of all, for the fascinating talk. Towards the end, you made the interesting suggestion that some of the core human needs you identify could be met by practices which are not conventionally understood as religious, for example, secular political movements. Could your insight about increasing Protestantization in religious life help us understand trends in emerging political fundamentalisms?
Very interesting question. So I suppose emerging political fundamentalisms means, the rise of nativism and populist movements. And can those be understood? Can the process of religious reforms in a Protestant type direction help us to understand those? I suppose. I mean, look, this is theorizing on the hoof. So there's been a lot of work. I mean, there's been a lot of deep journalism or long form journalism, which has looked at Trump supporters and people like that as sort of decontextualized, the individual people lost from their moorings, or kind of the collapse of community. So maybe there is some parallel there. It's difficult to say that, the Protestantization of Buddhism in Sri Lanka that happened in the 20th century was, as people became more middle class, is the same as the miserization of central the flyover states in the US. It's very difficult to say that that's the same thing. I think we're moving into it's it's also very dangerous to extrapolate from the past to the future. So I would hesitate to draw definite parallels there. But it's an interesting question. I need to think about that some more.
Thank you. Andrew Beattie from Brunel University. Does mysticism offer a counterweight or alternative to dominant religious forms, even as in Indonesia, an antagonist to official forms in conflating the functions you have so effectively described?
Yeah, mysticism. I mean, yeah, I mean, well, Andrew is one of the experts on religion in Indonesia, so I won't attempt to speculate about Indonesia. But I mean, yeah, I didn't talk much about mysticism. It is obviously a kind of R1 trend that can coexist comfortably with people not being outside of society. So kind of but is it a counterweight? Is this mysticism? Because I suppose the question is to the increasing fundamentalism or increasing homogenization or kind of mashing together of the different types of religion. I don't know. Is it an effective counterweight in Indonesia? Is mysticism in Egypt an effective counterweight? I mean, I don't get that impression, but I may be wrong. I mean, it's difficult to measure. Mysticism is terribly difficult to measure. You can see the effects of increasing fundamentalism very, very easily. I was very struck by a paper I heard by an American-based scholar of India, where he talked about these ghazal singing sessions and poetry sessions, which are held in Delhi these days, where in poetry and song, in Urdu. So it's interesting. You've got all these Brahmins, who you associate with the kind of anti-Urdu Hindi movement, composing new poems and songs in Urdu as a vehicle of opposition. You can sing things about Modi that you wouldn't get away with saying or writing in the newspaper. So maybe. I mean, look, many academics who've been horrified by the rise of fundamentalisms and the effects that those have put their faith in, or at least hoped that various mystical movements would be a counterweight. And I don't think that has really been effective in most of the Islamic world. But it's incumbent on us to try and understand why. It's certainly, I mean, it may be a resource. It's certainly a resource, and it's a place for internal opposition, internal exile, if you like. But it hasn't so far, anyway. Been any kind of political opposition. I mean, clearly that is, I don't think. I mean, you can answer the question far better than me about Indonesia, whether it's part of the solution.
Thank you, Diwakar Acharya from Oxford University. Where would you place self-cultivation aspect of religion in your scheme?
Well, definitely R1 it's self-cultivation is definitely a form of soteriology, a classic form of it, or whatever form it takes.
Thank you. Sorry, my signal dropped just for a moment there. Yan from SOAS has asked, does individual interpretation of the ritual matter in R2? Is there a degree of compromise of Weberian individual meanings in R2?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting things about ritual is that people can all participate in it and have very different understandings. And many people in this audience, as working anthropologists, must have had the experience of asking, what does this mean, or why is it done, and being given dozens of different explanations, or being told, go and ask the priest. We just do it. We don't know what it means or do it. And Charles Ramble used to like to say about the village where he did his PhD, his people had two explanations. One was, this is a very old custom. One was, this is an old custom. And the second explanation was, this is a very old custom. And that was it. That was all the explanation you could ever get out of them. And so, R2 rituals are done basically because the first line of justification and legitimation is always, we do this because we always do this. This is what we do at this time of year, or we do it because it has to be done. But then there may be kind of more sophisticated kind of reasons that come forward, and then but it's it's one of the things about not having a bureaucratized and official church whose job it is to come up with cut and dried explanations for these things. So the explanations can be as many as the experts.
Thank you. So we'll take two more questions, and then unfortunately we'll have to draw to a close. So Deki Yangzom from the Royal Tumpu College, do you have any specific comment on the projection theory of religion in Buddhism or Hinduism in the context of Southeast Asia or South Asia?
Gosh.
I was frightened to ask that one before we getting so
theory. I mean, I suppose, do you mean in a kind of Freudian sense or something? That, Buddhism in its original form claims to be, precisely the opposite of that. It's a kind of introjection, just looking inside yourself and seeing what's there and what isn't. And the Buddha claimed that he wasn't hiding anything, but of course there are many forms of Buddhism, and Mahayana Buddhism has got the techniques, which I did study a little bit when I was doing my PhD. The techniques that Buddhist Vajrayana priests do, the visualization techniques, are literally meant to be a form of visualization, a form of sadhana in the technical tantric sense is a kind of projection. You are meant to project from your body, visualize the divinities, and that's what makes the kind of ritual instruments that you're using sacred and powerful. So in that sense, go for it. It's a projection theory. So you can have, and of course Hinduism is so protean that you can have all kinds of answers for that. Look at some of the early works of Wendy Doniger on Hindu myths. You can certainly, if you want to use projection theory, you certainly can. Yeah.
Okay.
But I think it's very careful. Let me just say one final thing on that. I'm always very cautious, and I try to say, look, hang on a minute. When Westerners are very keen to rush in and say, the Shiva Linga is a phallic symbol, and there was outrage in the Indian Parliament when the parliamentarians discovered that a French exhibition in Paris in the 90s, I think it was, had an exhibition on India where Shiva Linga was labelled as un symbole phallique, and people were outraged. Certainly not. How can you do that? And of course, look, it's Hindu. The vast majority of Hindu women, when they're bowing down to a Shiva Linga, are not thinking this is a phallic symbol. Absolutely not. But if you go into the myths, you can make an argument. So I had a long fight with Mary Slusser when she was designing the captions for the Palace Museum in Lalitpur in the Mongol Bazaar, and she asked me to check them through. And I said I tried to, every time she put a phallic symbol, I crossed it out. She insisted on keeping it in one place.
You will. And our final word has to, of course, come from the director of the Royal Anthropological Institute. So David Shankland has asked, I was interested in your focus on Weber. Would it be legitimate, though, to regard your fascinating lecture as equally a dialogue with Durkheim?
Yes, I would like to see it as that. I would like to see it as obviously, I've been heavily influenced by Weber, but I'm also a big admirer of Durkheim. So I would like this to be seen as a useful and productive synthesis of the two. So if you're happy to see it that way, I'm certainly happy to take it that way.
Well, thank you very much indeed. This has been a most tremendous evening. So much learned from this evening, a real tour de force. And as I said, we would have had the applause if we possibly could. Professor Gellner, you have given us a truly memorable Henry Myers lecture, and we are so inordinately grateful to you for the time that you've given over this evening and the number of people that you will have influenced by your thoughts. So on behalf of everybody, on behalf of the Royal Anthropological Institute, thank you so very much indeed for this evening.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.